The Nintendo DS port of Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions has utterly disappointed me. I'm not even talking about the big picture, comparing this version to the console version when I say this. If I were looking at this game in a vacuum, where only this version existed, the vast gulf between my first impressions and my closing thoughts have left me feeling more betrayed than any game has managed in a long, long time. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions, released in 2010, was the first of a handful of games Beenox developed for the hero. Not counting a few earlier games they simply ported to different systems. And frankly, it was the best of their titles, too. The concept was a novelty for the time. Different Spider-Men had to team up for a multiversal doppelganger extravaganza. You likely associate the concept with the, understatement incoming, quite popular Spider-Verse movies. It's no coincidence. There's a direct lineage that started here. Dan Slott wrote this game, and later did Spider-Verse events in the comics to further play with the idea, which led to these masterpieces. For the time though, Shattered Dimensions was an oddball, which really helped it stand out. Most Spider-Man games of the era had a broad, sandbox New York, which started to blur together in a generic gray cityscape surrounded by, figuratively, every other game of the era doing the same thing. But Shattered Dimensions was instead placed in varied, linear levels, where a lot of Spider-Man games were explicitly based on the movies, or at the very least, stylized like them. Dimensions was canon to the comics. Pretty common for Spider-Man games of the era. It also had essentially the same version running on the relatively weak Wii as it did the stronger PS3 and 360, so it was very accessible for most gamers of the day to play. It's my favorite Spider game outside of the newer Insomniac titles, and it was lightning in a bottle. As Beenox progressed over their 4 games, they too eventually fell into the traps of generic open worlds for movie games that couldn't really make the same splash. Our 4 Spiders-Man for the console version were Amazing Spider-Man, our prototypical web-slinger, Spider-Man Noir, a grim and gritty 1930s detective from the Marvel Comics of the same subheading, Spider-Man 2099 from a cyberpunk future, and Ultimate Spider-Man, who was put into the symbiote suit to make him stand out from Amazing. Ultimate Spider-Man was still Peter Parker at the time, as Miles Morales did not exist until a year later. The whole game was a beat-em-up with an arcade-style rank for each level, and a good amount of variety. To contrast all of this with the DS version, Shattered Dimensions ends up being a mostly different game. This version was developed by Kryptonite, whom I have discussed here for Assassin's Creed 2 Discovery, a good game, and here for LEGO Star Wars on the Game Boy Advance, a not-so-good game. We end up with only 3 of the Spider-Men, losing Venom-suited Ultimate, and a complete genre switch over to a side-scrolling Metroidvania. Other than the main villain Mysterio, who sticks around as the main villain possessing the magic excuse plot MacGuffin, the other villains here are unique from the console version. The heroes start out with slightly different sets of abilities, but you can unlock other Spider-Men's skills in special locations, so they presumably all have everything if you play thoroughly. Amazing starts with the normal degrees of web swinging and wall crawling. Noir starts with web swinging and a spider sense, but weirdly can't wall crawl normally, and 2099 completely lacks web swinging at first, but does have gliding with his web wings. These are all sorts of mixed up choices. 2099 actually had organic webs in the comics, so it's bizarre he lacks web swinging here. Noir couldn't make webs normally in the comics, something Madame Web explicitly used her abilities to change in the console version, so it doubly would have made sense for him to start without web swinging. I still hadn't found normal wall crawling for Noir by the end of the game, though by that point I had reasons I wasn't looking to spend more time playing than necessary. We'll get back to that later. Just off of my first impressions, I was really digging this game. My genuine early thoughts were, is this version actually on par with the main version? I was wondering if I'd start to look like a Nintendo DS simp with so many glowing DS videos in a row. The art style looks great, with each world feeling unique and stylized, and though they're not huge, it's neat having actual areas to explore. Even with the limited chunks the DS can load at one time, there's continuity between areas. 2099's Nueva York is very vertical, so you can web zip up to a platform above you in the next area, and it actually works. You can also throw dudes to their deaths there. Fun fact. Enemy thugs tended to be unique for each villain, and when they weren't, the writing even took the time to justify a reason for repeating one enemy type. Voice lines are unique for this version, and one amusing version even accidentally predicted Miles Morales, who again did not exist yet.
To reach him, you'll use a power you've never had before, given to you by your other selves.
Oh, please be invisibility, please be invisibility, please be invisibility. Aw, no invisibility.
This version also really seemed to fix the biggest complaint I have with the console version. There, the Spider-Men only interact in the final cutscene, but here, while they are still only playable one at a time, they're at least swapping abilities and tossing their MacGuffin fragment back and forth, so it does feel a little more cohesive instead of completely segmented. Combat also started out feeling quite fun. You have grabs, throws, airborne combat, and can even throw their weapons around, and you keep unlocking new attacks as you explore. The heavy charged punch, while not often practical to use, is also extremely comical, as Spider-Man is clearly clowning around within the animation. It feels very in character. There is also a dodge mechanic, and while it requires some precise timing, it felt like one I could get better at with practice. Part of the way in though, the game trips and falls on its face, and I realized it had no idea how to build on this starting point successfully. Exploration turned almost entirely into requiring precision within the swinging and gliding mechanics, which the game never bothered to fully explain. So I just have to try over and over on the same tricky jumps or glides for minutes at a time. It felt like I was getting roadblocks stopping my entire sense of progression every short while. Combat never switched things up to require smart new strategies. Enemies simply started taking and dealing more damage. Obnoxiously, large enemies become present in almost every encounter, and they simply attack through your combos. Half of your new skills are ineffective or unsafe to try against them, and so you have to use your most rudimentary attacks on the tankiest goons. You'd think the advanced enemies would be resistant to basic attacks, and advanced moves would be needed, as that sounds like a normal difficulty curve, but you'd be sadly mistaken. Late in the game, I would just swing past enemies as much as possible, because there was no benefit to fighting them, and no consequence for skipping them. By the end, when it did force me to fight enemies, I would simply have to spam swinging attacks, because enemies were taking so much damage to take down, and dealing so much damage themselves, that trying to engage with the combat systems as intended was ineffective. It became a slog. There was even an obvious turning point, where the experience practically switched from mostly fun to, and there it goes. Throughout, when you send the tablet shard in Spider-Man's possession to the next Spider-Man, it doesn't just zoop through the portal. You have to play a touchscreen minigame to defend it from Mysterio. Now I assure you, dear viewer, that I will address the jarring, garish, nightmarish visual change you are about to witness once I explain the minigame. I'm not glossing over the emotional response you may be facing in this impending footage. I'm merely coming back to it. If you're, like, a woman or child from the 1930s that still thinks traveling 20 miles per hour in a Model T will disintegrate your non-manly skeleton and devastate your hymen, maybe look away now. What in the David Lynch? This minigame escalates in difficulty so fast that by the midway point of the game, I was genuinely dreading playing it again. I have played entire horror games that instilled less dread in me than standing there in front of the portals the button prompt flashing at me. I mean, sure, one of those horror games was the Callisto Protocol, but that's not important right now. The premise is simple. Spin the tablet to start building up its power, touch the tentacle dudes to destroy them, and touch and hold on the hands to destroy them. If they touch the tablet, you lose power. This quickly became the worst minigame experience of my life. How long should a normal, routine minigame take you? 30 seconds? Maybe a whole minute if it's intentionally labeled as hard? Take a guess how long the most egregious occasion took me. Go ahead and write the answer down in your workbook. I'll give you a moment. I've got plenty of this footage. You're wrong. I spent nearly 35 goddamn minutes to get past this on the worst occasion. Allow me to explain. Problem 1. The Nintendo DS's touchscreen is something called a resistive touchscreen. It's not like modern touchscreens. To simplify, it is two barely separated layers, and the touch registers when you push down on the top one. Unlike your phone, it can only handle one point of contact at a time. Normal developers back then took this into account when programming Nintendo DS games. Problem 2. Kryptonite didn't take this into account, apparently. Frequently, multiple locations on screen will need your attention immediately so you don't lose progress, which I restate is physically impossible in a game programmed for the Nintendo DS. When these guys reach your tablet, which they will, since on frequent occasions you can't address them all, you drain the power you've built up at an alarmingly fast rate. You can be at 95% and a single bastard can drop you back to 0 faster than Gwen Stacy tasting the pavement. Problem 3. Those hands I mentioned need a relatively long time to hold down to destroy them. Such a long time that sometimes your subconscious brain will say, that felt like it was the full length, but no, that hand isn't gone yet, and there's another one, and 6 tentacly boys. See problem 2. Problem 4. The tablet can and will stop spinning. Sometimes it's from the enemies hitting it, sometimes it's because you accidentally nudged it, and sometimes because, why the fuck not stop for no goddamn reason. So then you have to get it spinning again, in between also defending it. And all the while you're trying to fight past those hurdles, you're getting blasted by this audio-visual psychosexual hellscape that would give Sigmund Freud pause even after he got hired on as a new Cenobite. If you had told me this was footage of the conception of the Eraserhead baby, I would not believe you. There's no way the Eraserhead baby would be as normal as it is from this. The only possible explanation for how this fucking minigame got approved by playtesters is that the absolute serial killer who programmed the damn thing literally crucified the first playtester to complain about it to keep the others silent. And honestly, as that playtester struggled in agony to hold himself up by the rusty nails impaling his screaming flesh, his final thoughts before succumbing to the void were probably, well, at least I won't have to play that minigame again. Jesus Christ. Let's just break into the plot before I'm permanently trapped within that pulsing pink tunnel. Amazing Spider-Man starts us off in New York City with more than a few vibes of Assassin's Creed 2 Discovery. Unlike the console game, which relegated the intro to a cutscene, we get to go and intercept Mysterio, who has already stolen the Tablet of Order and Chaos. After a brief warm-up boss fight, the tablet breaks and pieces dart off into the other realities, so Madame Web has to organize the Spiders 3. Noir is up first, running around in a big museum, which means sometimes I get to see low-poly dinosaur bones. That is pretty cool, not gonna lie. He also briefly starts off with a hat and a trench coat, very amusingly reminding me of his look as of Spider-Verse. The first fragment is in the possession of the noir version of Boomerang, everyone's second favorite Australian stereotype villain who uses this famously tricky to master yet limited weapon against a powerful hero several times higher than their own weight class. Turns out, boomerangs return even faster when some jagoff hurls it right back at your fucking skull. Get a better weapon, dingus. His shard gives the power to ground pound through thick concrete. 2099 goes after his version of Vulture next, which ends up being a bit harder than it should at this point in the game, especially without web swinging yet, but it wasn't anything insurmountable. This fragment just unlocks power fusion, which lets the spiders eventually get each other's abilities, but you have to go to specific places to do so and complete a challenge. That challenge is just more of the identical combat from everywhere else. Anyway, this gives 2099 his webs. Normal Amazing has to go through one of these to get Noir's version of Spider Sense, which can exclusively detect invisible off switches. And then he takes down Tinkerer, a man who invents robots by taking out his generators. He also name drops selling robots to Electro, so we know he will be popping up later. This new ability just makes webs strong enough to pull down specific walls. Then hell happened. I refuse to talk about it again. Noir goes after Calypso here, who is either a bad 1930s voodoo stereotype or a bad 2010 voodoo stereotype depending on your perspective. Her enemies are at least visually interesting and varied, albeit obnoxious with the flying mask things and way too many huge tombstone golems. The finicky gliding also ground things to a screeching halt, as this part of the game was clearly designed to fuck you since he hasn't unlocked wall crawling. At least her boss fight isn't terrible, though it does rely too heavily on fighting normal enemies, something I was extremely weary of by this point. The new power just reveals fake walls with the spider sense, which does not feel significantly different from just revealing secret levers, and so just felt underwhelming, as though the developers were running out of novel ideas in real time as I played. 2099 goes and fights Silvermane. Just normal Silvermane. He has lived into the future since he is a cyborg. He wasn't a thrilling fight at all, just a tanky fight. This power lets you swing off of electrified ceilings, a problem that only exists because they needed to invent new problems to overcome with new abilities. I know I'm not being very charitable, but they were not being very good at Metroidvania, so I'm unwilling to budge on it. Amazing has to then take the world's longest elevator ride down to get to Electro, fighting enemies the whole time. And then I died, sending me back to an obnoxiously disparate checkpoint. I then took down Electro on the first try. The boss fight was anticlimactically less hard than the elevator ride down to the boss fight. The final new ability, the Spider Dash, automatically happens when you build up enough momentum while running to smash through our now third different type of breakable surface. This is also the most finicky ability in the game, bar none. It never explains the controls, and sometimes it requires you to run up along walls or change directions somehow to get lined up with the breakable surfaces, which meant even more trial and error gameplay when trying to progress through the endgame. So rather than switching back over to another spider, Amazing just proceeds after Mysterio into the new dimension he's building with all of his newfound power. The location gets eldritch, as do the enemies, with weird spiky rock dudes and flying brains, which get let down by generic Cyclops, which feel just as lazy and uninspired as they do out of place. Halfway through his zone, I was stuck on one particular platforming moment when I had a moment of shock and horror. I realized I needed the web wings, but Amazing Spider-Man hadn't unlocked them. See, every time prior there was a plot-essential new power, it always marked it as an objective you had to complete before it would let you proceed. In this one singular instance, they broke with that pattern and skipped that step completely. If they had left all of the powers up to the player to figure out and find, that wouldn't inherently be unheard of for the genre. However, If you establish a pattern to train the player otherwise, and then break that pattern with no indication, that's on you, asshole. I had to go back to the starting area, play the touchscreen minigame knowing I would have to come right back to it, find the new power room, fight through even more goons I didn't want to fight, go back to the portal room, play that touchscreen minigame again, and then proceed through the new zone from scratch as it had reset. And this had all occurred right after spending a long-ass time trying to make the spider dash behave. Hey, here's another question for you. What percentage of the runtime should be considered reasonable for fighting the final boss? I don't have a concrete right answer for this one. It probably depends on the game. But I do have a concrete wrong answer. If you spend about 38% of your total runtime just fighting the final boss in any game longer than, like, an hour, something has likely gone wrong. My total playtime ended up being a bit over 9 hours. I spent more than 3.5 hours just trying to beat Mysterio. I really hope I did the math correctly, but I also left the numbers vague enough that you can't necessarily pin me down. Ha ha, take that, math nerds. It wasn't even that he was a difficult boss to figure out. After the first couple of attempts, I had mostly solved what to do during each of his different attacks. It's just that he dishes out so much damage, with such a large health bar, and so few opportunities to actually attack him, that mistakes have ample time to accumulate until you die. Your most damaging attacks end up being too risky to land, and will get you killed attempting to do them too often in the long run. So you just have to keep chipping away at him, waiting for him to do the few things that will allow you to attack him, and hope you don't mess up too many times. It took me 6.5 minutes to win on my successful attempt, and I would typically get killed between 2 to 5 minutes on those earlier attempts. All of this is to say, I only keep track of numbers and shit when I'm really getting pissed at a game. So I was really getting pissed at the game. Shitty Dimensions had the gall to include one last timed escape moment as Mysterio's dimension crumbled before it even let me beat the game. But then, I was finally free. Normally, I'd look further in at additional gameplay modes or alternate costumes, and this game does apparently have both. But no. Fuck that noise. This game lifted my spirits high in the air just so it could body slam me into the pavement far below. It doesn't get a second more of my time. If you're going to play Shattered Dimensions, just stick to the console version. I considered having one last bait-and-switch joke as a metaphor for this port, perhaps setting up a delicious calzone, but you bite into it and find the crucified playtester inside. But no, if this version of Spider-Man Shattered Dimensions gets to have a really promising setup that never pays off satisfactorily,